I think the key is previous, so the snow's not my fault unless you like it, and then you're very welcome. So this morning we've heard from wise, smart, intelligent, attractive people. We want to bring that down with the next presentation so that the speakers in the forums this afternoon are elevated up, so I'm taking one for the team. You're going to hear the government perspective, and our Deputy Minister actually wanted to be here, so he does send his regrets, and it's probably appropriate given we're in the election cycle, and so notwithstanding the fact that this is being filmed, I think I can be a bit more frank. I'll find out later today if I can be, but my hope is to. I will say, actually, to preface as well, is that as sort of sometimes facts, even though they were questions, very good questions stated in the first presentation and reiterated throughout, sometimes were sort of bringing me down. I am an optimist, so I liked the glass half full sort of analogy. I think the reality is that a lot of people can criticize where we're at in the province with respect to water, with respect to the oil sands and those awful, disgusting pictures of industrial development. But that said, they were developed at a time and under a framework that reflected what I'd say is the philosophy and the interests of all Albertans. We're in a democracy, and that's the intent, and we can argue and debate that to some extent. But I'd say, I think rightfully, we should be asking the questions of why are we doing that, not for the sake of saying it's wrong or it's bad, but to say, so what do we need to change? And one of the things I found interesting, I've been in the water branch for about 6 or 7 months. The first day I brought in bottled water, and I was feeling the burning eyes all day, and somebody fortunately told me what that was. It wasn't bad hair or whatever per normal, it was the water bottle. And so I liked these cups, and I'd encourage people to use the reusable cups, as I swear by them now for a lot of reasons. But this isn't going to change the world just by having them available. It's the people that every day that you see on the street having them in your hands is going to change the world, because that's a water ethic and a change in philosophy that I'd say we're not there yet. We're asking the right questions as a province. I think we're ahead of a lot of other people in the world that have already hit a wall, but it's not just making cups available, it's actually using them, and all Albertans, all 3.5 million going to 6 to 7 million. And so I think we're at a time where we need to start speaking to it, not critical of the past, but hopefully optimistic of the future. And that's far more rambling than I was hoping to talk to, but really excited by the earlier speakers, and so that's just what I wanted to throw out as some starting context. I am here to talk about the Provincial Wetland Policy. Again, when I first started, it was, so, what are you going to do to move that policy forward? It's been a few years in the making. More recently, it's where the heck is that policy? So I'm going to give you a bit of updates as to where that is, in part because it is an important water priority that has been identified, but also many people in the room have not only contributed to the work that's been done to date, but we'll be using some of the, the policy and providing the expertise and the knowledge and the capacity to realize the outcomes of the wetland policy. But I do want to talk a bit more before that about a bit of the provincial context that's helping to guide and shape where we take the wetland policy. I also want to touch on some of the emerging focus areas, and we heard some of them already this morning. I'm just going to touch on them lightly, in part because they're very sensitive, so I'm going to skirt around those. Also speak to the management approach, and it's important, I think, to spend some time. We've already heard about regional planning, regional frameworks. I'm going to be mutually supportive of the direction, thank goodness, that we do have to think regionally under provincial direction and guides, so I'll talk to that. Then finally get into where we're going on wetlands, and then some moving forward pieces. And again, I'll stress that a lot of this is being built based on the direction from not only our current minister, who's very passionate about water, but also our previous minister in terms of a lot of the water priorities that many of you have been working on for a number of years. We're trying to move some across the line. We're hopeful that wetlands is one of the first that does move across the line. And it is about trying to reprofile and demonstrate. 03 is when Water for Life came out. More recently, we've added water to the title. It's not just smoke and mirrors. It's to, oh yeah, let's not forget that is important. And sometimes by writing it down and having it front and center, it's important to make sure we're actually being accountable as a government to delivering on water-related issues, but also reminding people that it is something that we all need to be thinking about. So one of the, I think, common sense sort of statements that sometimes is dangerous to say when you match it against some of the pictures you saw, but we are a resource-based economy. We benefit from jobs, schools, healthcare, etc. From it, so we can't deny it. But natural resources does include agriculture, does include forestry, it includes tourism, other natural and intrinsic values, so we can't lose sight of that. And we know that at least for this foreseeable future, it will be part of our society from an economic, environmental, social perspective. So we have to at least accept that. Doesn't mean we can't shape and guide where it goes. It's just a base foundation. Some of the experiences that we have with resource management, whether it's oil and gas or forestry, we should use that. We are using it in terms of how we manage water and how we have over the past 100 years. But there's some experiences in how we can grow food for growing demand globally in a better way, how we can provide secure energy in a more responsible way, both renewable and non-renewable in the foreseeable future. But at the same time, we know that there is a growing focus and this reemergence of the social license associated with energy development that we need to be cognizant of and incorporate. And then there is this shift in abundance from room to grow to the need to rethink how much space we have. And this has been a statement that has been within literature provincially and broadly for the last 30 or 40 years, actually. I think what's more unique is the pace and the increased rate of change that we heard from Bob from earlier. We're moving outside of the norms, and the pace that we're able to keep up is becoming a greater challenge. But growth has always been a part of our reality. It's something that's driven into us, that growth and development is good. We need to challenge that. What type of growth do we want to see? What type of development? So some of the areas that as a government we have identified from a water lens that we need to focus on, the tailings ponds, again, we saw those wonderful images. Again, at the time it made sense. We didn't want to, we had a no release policy of treated water into the Athabasca River. Let's put it into tailings ponds, the stuff's going to settle, we can reuse that. 40 years later, probably took a little too long to realize it wasn't working. But now we're being challenged, and we're challenging industry to do better and do it differently. So rather than criticize or question why we got to that point, let's accept that we're there and accept that we actually have some knowledge to maybe, with the right policies, with the right push, to do something about it. Monitoring we heard about, we need to elevate to move to this world-class, maybe it should be strategic world-class monitoring system to make it even grayer. Drinking water, wastewater systems, the sustainability, it's sort of an elephant in the room, in part because oil sands, it's isolated. We can all say, yeah, we're concerned about it, but it really doesn't affect us. Turning on the taps, whether it's some of the challenges with Aboriginal communities or even smaller communities that rely on wastewater systems, we're blessed, I think, in Edmonton and Calgary, some of the larger areas for the systems we have, but the broad sustainability of our system is something that we need to be thinking about. Fracking, hydraulic fracturing, shale gas is the common term. It's on the landscape. We've seen it start in the eastern U.S. and BC is eager to develop it. It's happening in Alberta, not necessarily shale gas, but tight oil through multi-stage hydraulic fracturing. And water is a fundamental issue. It's also as much about that competition for land. We're now seeing people going back to wells on farms, or people that have retired and moved out to a rural community. There's a dynamic and a tension there that perhaps we had more tolerance in the past with oil and gas that we don't have now. So we have to hit that head on, in addition to the environmental management systems that need to be enhanced. Again, just touching on that. And then water management. A lot of people talked about some of the southern challenges. It's allocation markets certainly have to play a role in it, but we're defining the challenge more as water management. Let's look at what we have as a resource, and let's see what the opportunities are to properly and more effectively manage it, from conservation to storage to timing of delivery. And so there's been some great work to date that gives us a starting point on that. All of these take time, effort, money. Somebody has to do something. So it's one thing to say, yeah, we need to do it, let's move on. Somebody has to pay. Now that investors are getting interested in environmental and social responsibility, they're ultimately the ones that have to pay, so that's a good thing to have them in the room, but we have to acknowledge that somebody does have to pay. A lot of the focus on the monitoring and enforcement and the need for, I guess, a government to say we are looking to world class, it's less about us putting that brand on, but more people looking at our systems and saying, okay, we're not sure what you have been doing over the last little while, and let's be clear, we do have extensive monitoring going on in across the province, including oil sands. What's emerging is it just isn't enough to give us the information we need, in part because of the pace of the development and the diversity of development. So we're not starting from nothing, but where we need to go is a big step forward that we have to acknowledge. But it's not simply just getting more data out and getting more information. It's about being more transparent in what we collect. We collect a lot of information. It's not typically hidden. It's just we haven't, as a government, done a good job in saying, okay, what information is relevant to the public that they should be aware of, and putting it out in a useful way versus reams and reams of Excel data sheets that some of us might actually be okay with. So we do have an oil sands information portal that gives a geospatial view of the oil sands. You can click on any particular operation and see how much water they're using, what their air footprint is, etc. It's a start. Credibility of the system. Again, we can create the best system within the government and working with experts, and we can put it online, but if people don't trust the credibility of who's running it, then it's all for naught. And so perception is a critical component that we need to be aware of. So independence, ensuring it's best available science, that it's adaptive is equally critical. And relevance. So again, we can look to the current regulatory regime matched against the realities, whether it's oil sands, hydraulic fracturing, municipal water management, and say there's just a disconnect there. It's because we haven't necessarily always kept up, and it's hard to sometimes change because we have federal interests, provincial interests, municipal interests. We haven't necessarily effectively engaged Albertans in a lot of these conversations. We bring people together, experts, stakeholders on a particular issue, we get some options and we try and move them forward versus maybe getting a more collaborative ongoing relationship built to deal with ongoing issues. And that's something our minister has stressed is we need to start having conversations and true engagement versus just going out with ideas and solutions almost to say, are you okay with that? So relevance is critical both in terms of the systems we use but also the data that we collect. So nothing magical in there, but it's something that sometimes admitting you have the problem is the first step, and I think we've acknowledged that we need to up the game in that regard. And I like that statement, we are government, so it's not just taking the blame, it's everybody in the room that votes. The shift that we are seeing, there is a shift in environmental management because of the pace of development, the diversity of the development. It is largely through the lens of the land use framework, which is looking at, rather than one-off authorizations, is looking to how to approve and allow or not allow activities to go ahead, looking at both the air, land, water, and other land impacts in a more integrated manner, both today and forward-looking to know where growth is. Typically, it's you want to come in to drill a well. Okay, who else is there? What's the impact today? There's space to move, go ahead, without necessarily thinking about what if somebody next year or 2 years down the road wants to drill a well for groundwater. So forward-looking is critical. But it's also a step forward in terms of the decision matrix to not only think about the cumulative impacts, but also to bring in the economic, environmental, and social dynamics into the decision making. And not specifically as a government saying, well, we think you've elected us as elected officials, we think these are the types of activities we want, and so that's what we'll see. But at a regional level, at a community level, there is a true test and a challenge to those in a community to say, what are the values, the societal criteria we want to guide and influence activity so that when somebody says no, a director in the Department of Environment and Water, for example, it's not because they've said no or a minister has said no or a premier, but it's because the criteria doesn't allow it. And I think that's what people have been fearful of is to say no or to slow down because we haven't necessarily developed the criteria. So part of the evolution that we're seeing within these frameworks is to incorporate that. We also know that the criteria, the values in one part of the province may not be the same as other parts of the province, so we do have to look at it from that perspective. So we've heard that already. And so there is this paradigm shift that when you think about the tools that we're using, you know, there's nothing magical or earth-shattering in it, but it's sometimes let's just start doing it or locking down and codifying what we should be doing and putting it into some form of legislated or something more than just a good public planning process. And so these frameworks that we're developing for air, land, water, to regional bases, these are really it's the foundation of where we're trying to go on cumulative effects management, where we're setting geographic barriers and identifying what are the no-go zones for air capacity, for water capacity, etc., and saying these are truly no-go. In many instances, we haven't hit those yet, thank goodness, but we will, based on the predictions that we heard earlier, if we don't change some of the courses that we're on. So how do we not only define those with some scientific rigor, and then also develop the triggers to say when we're heading towards some of these thresholds that we initiate appropriate management action that changes the current behavior, that incents innovation, change, some form of motivation that will enable us to avoid those triggers. And that's where the cost impact comes in. We all can point to industry or others say, you know, you need to do more of that, or et cetera. There's a cost there that we need to be cognizant of, and we have to understand that it's a prudent cost. We have to know what the cost is. It's prudent, and it's nested within the context of some alternatives that we may need to consider. And historically, the alternatives have been, okay, well, it's the cost of not allowing that activity could be jobs, et cetera. Well, we need to broaden that scope. Finally, wetlands, and hopefully I still have some time to actually talk about wetlands. So one of the reasons why I think it is important to talk about that context is the direction that we are trying to go on wetlands is to reflect the philosophy of cumulative effects management. It's to acknowledge that there are different parts of the province that are seeing different impacts or have seen different impacts, that not all wetlands are created equal, so we want to have some flexibility. And also in the tools and the approach that we implement to manage wetlands, that we have to be more innovative and flexible. And it's not to say that the current interim policy that's been in place for some time in the white zone and the approval-based process for the green zone has been inappropriate, but I think we haven't necessarily had a province-wide direction, philosophy, intent on wetlands. And so one of the first things that we initiated with likely input from some of you in the room is just what is the intent of the policy? What's the scope? What are we trying to really achieve here that's maybe different than the previous policy? And it is province-wide. That's critical. It is important to identify what's in scope, and it is about looking at both conserved and natural and restored, wetlands. We have to acknowledge that there are activities and decisions that have been made in the past with respect to expectations around wetland management, so we have to in some form respect that. It could be a go-forward approach, but let's accept that we've made some of those decisions. But the key shift is clarity and outcomes. So ideally, under the current system, we like wetlands. We want to protect them to the extent possible, but we haven't necessarily articulated what that means, how we're going to approach it. So in a revised policy, we speak to high-value wetlands. We use the term value of wetlands and acknowledge that wetlands have values. We want to ensure that the benefits are conserved today and into the future. And I think equally important, as I said earlier, that we have to recognize that there are different regional circumstances for wetlands. So a place-based framework that does allow for flexible tools both in the assessment of wetlands, but equally in terms of how we look at compensation and mitigation. There is a massive shift that we're trying to introduce in moving just from an area-based to a function-based. And I think it's good in principle, but we have to ensure that we have the right information and the right metrics. So area in and of itself, I guess, is a function, but it's broadening that function to understand the broad range of values and benefits that the wetlands provide, and I'll talk a bit more about that next. And then compensation. It's always been the elephant in the room. People at the end of the day need to know, if I've avoided, I've minimized, now I need to compensate. How much is that going to cost me? And we're trying to first and foremost say, if we can avoid that conversation, that's our preference. Avoid and minimize would be a priority for us, certainly is a hierarchy. And then compensation not only has to be a last resort, but also reflect the value of the impact that the value of the wetland that has been impacted. And we know that it's beyond just area, and it's also the impact in the south may be different given the trends of wetland loss relative to maybe central or north. So it's something that we have to be aware of. And we also have identified the importance of introducing both replacement and non-replacement measures, or at least have the option. And I think that concerns people, because a non-replacement measure might mean, instead of going into wetland restoration, there's money going into something else. There is a need from a scientific perspective, from mapping to the establishment of a strengthened policy around the functions and the metrics to promote best management practices and other non-regulatory tools. There is a need to have that component. It's just a matter of how much should it cover. So I mentioned the move away from area to include area, but also add relative function. And it really is looking at the ecological and the human contribution of wetlands. And so it is, as I said, I think a logical, simple step forward, but it's the science behind it that requires a bit of work. But as a minimum, we have worked with various stakeholders to develop some of the guiding principles to allow that the metrics that we do identify are effective, adaptable, predictable, because we need them to be clear for the developers that are maybe having an impact on wetlands, but also as citizens that are trying to understand what the implications of such a policy from an impact and an outcome perspective, they need to be clear as well. So there's a range of metrics that we've identified, from ecological health, water quality, etc. I think there's about 18 or so potential metrics that we're currently exploring over the next year. And the relative function is not just a back end, okay, we now have a clear sense of what the value of that wetland is, so this is what your compensation ratio needs to be if you are going to have an impact. It really is informing the upfront assessment that proponents need to appreciate when they're proposing to undertake a project that will have an impact on wetlands. They need to appreciate what the relative value is based on its function. And then also through the avoid and the minimize, and ultimately through compensation if that's where the process goes. So as I mentioned, the work on the intent piece is generally complete. The general direction on relative function is complete. We've also been doing work on wetland mapping, and so we have had for some time various provincial or sub-provincial inventories. So we've are working to fill in gaps and amalgamate all those inventories and putting them under a common classification. So that's a good starting point of just what is the wetland resource. Again, we can explore how relative to, say, 1960 we are today, but really this is about taking a look at appreciating some of the impacts we've had over the past, but what does it mean at a provincial scale moving forward about how we want to maintain and enhance provincial wetlands. So having a comprehensive inventory is critical in that regard. Similarly, we know that not all wetlands are created equal, and so we've tried to not only at the regional level acknowledge that there's various needs and intent, but also within the functional scale that whether it's a watershed or some other unit, that's a grouping where we're more likely to see like wetlands, and so assessing impact in terms of loss or function in that regard is an area that we're moving to, but further work is required. And then there will be site assessment tools that are building off of what currently are in use, but really getting to the ground to appreciate we can map and do an assessment of the value of wetlands at a broad scale, but actually on the ground confirming and validating that's the case. So the final piece of the wetland policy that people are eager and waiting for, it's going to be, how much is this going to cost, if you will, is the mitigation piece. And it's there has been some thinking within the department, and so these building blocks begin to reflect the policy elements we know we need to work on. Recognizing that this work has been informed by the Alberta Water Council, the work of ministerial advisory groups, other associations, we think we have a good starting point of at least identifying the blocks. So there's a value matrix that we know has to be compiled that reflects function and abundance. So through this you're going to have an A and a B and a C type wetland where A is a higher value than a D or an E. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, A, B, C, whatever the case may be, but it's that stacking order that's critical. There is an avoid minimize assessment. So again, that's where the priority and the focus of the policy has to be, is to say do everything you can to avoid out of the gate, and then minimize where possible, and then we'll move to a discussion on compensation. But right now it's more of an amorphous sort of engagement with proponents, back and forth sort of opportunities between the department and proponents to minimize footprint. Sometimes there's public input into that process. What we want to do is to be more consistent and articulate in the tools that we use to do that assessment, similar to where we may go on the oil field injection policy, which promotes saline ground groundwater versus non-saline groundwater versus surface water, where proponents have to demonstrate an economic case of why they may be not using saline groundwater, for example. So that could be a path that we may want to pursue. And then compensation, and really how much, at the end of the day, after we've avoided and minimized, how much is that ratio, and having an appreciation on a function basis of what the appropriate compensation might be. And right now for the white zone, it's 3-to-1. And so now we need to appreciate, when we get into what an A, a B, a C, and D is, what are the associated ratios that reflect the intent and the broad outcomes of the policy. And then finally, we'll see restoration, not just I impact an acre here, so I'm going to replace 3 acres there, but make sure that we consider the value. It's the contribution that the wetland being impacted is reflected in the response through compensation, as well as what's actually being compensated. Underpinning that is the knowledge foundations. I talked about some of the non-replacement concepts might feed into that. Government, industry, others will feed into it, but it's having the right information and knowledge systems to know that we have a coherent and effective system, and that'll continue to improve over time. But it's got to be funded in some form, and so one mechanism may be a non-replacement option. And critical is regional intent, and that's going to help to guide what we may want to see, not only province-wide, but also maybe at a regional scale. So we may acknowledge that in the south, restoration may be where we want to put some focus in our management intent, and that could inform perhaps how much non-replacement compensation we may allow. It may inform how much investment in compensation outside that region we may want to allow. It acknowledges that the oil sands will continue to be developed in some form, not at any cost, but it's perhaps the approach we take to managing wetlands may be different, again, in terms of how we drive towards certain restoration and compensation actions. So we know that there could be some form of hierarchy. Obviously, restoration in place is preferred to the region, preferred to maybe other priority areas. But the actual management intent by region across the province may shape and form those in different ways. We also have to, I guess, acknowledge that there are activities right now, requirements for reclamation that companies see that require some form of reclamation or bringing the land back. We know that from a wetland perspective, it hasn't been effective. It's been tied more to a comparable land use, and so we need to strengthen that. But there are securities, and there's a temporal dynamic where we know the land is coming back at some point over time. So if there's a way we can incorporate that, there may be value. There are also, as part of the discussion going forward, the tools, the pieces that people like you in the room will be using, the elements of the final policy framework from both the replacement and the non-replacement requirements. This notion of banking, where people might be able to have a wetland bank that they can tap into, putting some more rigor and strengthening the restoration agent process to allow not only more people to do it, but also more as I said, rigor and certification through that process. And then the development of the appropriate assessment tools is an area that we're going to be working on over the coming year. So this just summarizes a bit of the shift to highlight that we're not going from nothing to something, that there are general elements of the current policy reflected in where we're going. Our intent is to reflect this direction over the coming year. It's all in the context of where the government is looking more broadly about development on the landscape, so we have to accept that resource development is happening. We have identified wetlands as a priority for the department, notwithstanding the outcome post-April 23rd, but it's clear that water is top of mind for Albertans, and so we're confident that we'll continue to be able to work away at this policy. Regional frameworks are a critical element of the approach that we're taking to develop requirements and to move towards the conceptual. Yeah, we might have some thresholds we might cross to codifying them and then actually having recourse if we're heading towards them. And as I said, notwithstanding where things might go on land use planning, regional frameworks, formally, the tools that we're developing, we have no doubt will underpin any cumulative effects management approach that we take. So on the wetland policy, stay tuned. We hope to engage a stakeholder group over the next year on those mitigation policy blocks, so that the current minister, her intent was to have something delivered by the end of the year. We think it's possible. Industry wants certainty. The public expects, I think, certainty. So that's what we're certainly aiming towards. But the policy we put in place may be a first step at this shift, because we may not have all of the science to do all of what we want, but we know we have to at least move forward a policy that takes this step, and so that's the charge that we're focused on. And with that, I thank you for your time.